The transport shuttle landed with a heavy thud on the cracked landing pad. Dust rose in thick clouds around the small vessel as its engines powered down. Taman stepped out into the dim light of the shipyard, his worn boots hitting the ground with purpose. He carried only a battered toolbox in one hand and a small travel bag in the other. Everything he owned fit in those two containers. The Vraxian shipyard stretched for miles in every direction. Mountains of broken spacecraft rose like metal tombstones against the purple sky. This planet was where damaged ships came to die. The air smelled of rust and oil. Ancient machines stood silent, their purpose forgotten long ago. Taman walked through the narrow paths between piles of scrap metal. His eyes scanned the horizon until he found what he was looking for. There at the far end of the yard lay the dragon. Even from a distance he could see how massive it was. The war cruiser was easily 3 times the size of any other vessel in the yard. Its dark hull was covered in blast marks and holes. One wing hung at an odd angle, barely attached to the main body. He had seen pictures of the dragon before, back when it was new and powerful. Those images showed a sleek vessel that could cut through space like a knife through water. The ship before him now looked nothing like those photos. It looked dead. It looked impossible to fix. A group of Vraxian workers stood near the dragon's landing ramp. They were tall creatures with blue-gray skin and 4 arms. Their large eyes tracked Taman as he approached. One of them, bigger than the others, stepped forward. His translator device crackled to life. "You are the human mechanic?" the Vraxian asked. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "Yes. My name is Taman." The Vraxian made a sound that might have been laughter. "You came all this way to look at that broken ship? You are wasting your time, human. That vessel is beyond repair. Every engineer who has examined it says the same thing." "I would like to see it for myself," Taman said quietly. The Vraxian shrugged with all 4 shoulders. "Your choice. We cleared you for access. You can go inside, but be careful. Some sections have no air. Some floors might collapse. If you die in there, we are not responsible." Taman nodded and walked past the workers. Behind him, he heard them talking in their own language. He did not need a translator to know they were laughing at him. He had heard that sound many times before. Humans were often treated as jokes by the other races. Their technology was considered primitive. Their methods were called outdated. Let them laugh, Taman thought. Words could not hurt him. He had learned that lesson long ago. The entrance ramp groaned under his weight as he climbed aboard. Inside, the dragon was dark and cold. Emergency lights flickered weakly in some corridors, casting strange shadows on the walls. Taman pulled a flashlight from his toolbox and switched it on. The main hallway was wide enough for 5 people to walk side by side. Cables hung from the ceiling like vines in a dead forest. Panels had been torn from the walls, exposing the ship's inner workings. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. Each drop echoed through the empty vessel. Taman moved slowly through the ship, studying everything. He ran his hands along the walls, feeling the texture of the metal. He examined the damage to each system. He took notes in a small book he kept in his pocket. Hours passed. He did not stop to rest. The quantum core room was in the center of the ship. When Taman finally reached it, he understood why everyone said the dragon could not be fixed. The core was the heart of the vessel. It powered everything. Without it, the ship was just an empty shell. The core chamber was massive. In the center stood a column of crystal that reached from floor to ceiling. But the crystal was shattered. Huge cracks ran through it like spider webs. Large pieces had broken off and lay on the floor. The blue glow that should have filled the room was gone. Only darkness remained. Taman stood there for a long time just looking. He thought about all the engineers who had come before him. They had looked at this broken core and seen an impossible task. They had walked away because their training told them it could not be done. But Taman had never been good at following the rules. His teachers back on Earth had always complained that he did things his own way. He used methods that were not in any manual. He combined techniques that should not work together. Sometimes his creations failed, but sometimes they succeeded in ways no one expected. He set down his toolbox and sat on the floor of the core chamber. From his bag, he pulled out a small device and began scanning the broken crystal. The device beeped and displayed data on its tiny screen. Taman studied the numbers, his eyes moving quickly across the information. Outside, the sun was setting. The purple sky turned darker. The other workers had gone home for the night. The shipyard was silent except for the wind moving through the piles of scrap metal. Inside the Dragon, Taman worked by the light of his flashlight. He took measurements. He made drawings. He calculated numbers in his notebook. His hands moved with practiced ease, even though his face showed the deep concentration of a man solving a difficult puzzle. Finally, as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Taman stood up. He placed one hand on the broken quantum core. The crystal was cold to the touch, dead. But not forever dead, he thought. Nothing was truly beyond repair if you were willing to work hard enough. I will fix you, he whispered to the silent ship. They all say it cannot be done. But I will prove them wrong. I will bring you back to life. The ship, of course, did not answer. But in the darkness of that broken chamber, Taman made a promise. He would rebuild the Dragon from scratch if he had to. He would replace every damaged part. He would find solutions to problems that had no answers. He would work until his hands bled and his body gave out, and he would not stop until the Dragon flew again. That night, Taman slept on the floor of the ship. He had no bed, no blankets, but he did not care about comfort. He had found his purpose. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow he would start the impossible task of bringing a dead ship back to life. The Vraxian workers would laugh at him again. The engineers would shake their heads. The overseers would call him foolish. But Taman had stopped caring what others thought long ago. He knew something they did not know. He knew that humans had a special gift. They were too stubborn to know when to quit. Morning came with harsh yellow sunlight streaming through the holes in the Dragon's hull. Taman woke with a stiff back and sore muscles. He stood slowly, stretching his arms above his head. Then he picked up his toolbox and got to work. The first task was simple. He needed to know exactly what was broken. Every system, every wire, every panel. This would take time, but it was necessary. You could not fix something if you did not understand it completely. He started at the front of the ship and worked his way back. He crawled through narrow maintenance tunnels. He climbed up vertical shafts using old service ladders. He squeezed through gaps that were barely wide enough for a human. The ship was huge and every section had damage. Days passed. Taman created detailed maps of the Dragon's systems. He drew diagrams showing how power used to flow through the vessel. He made lists of parts that needed replacing. The lists grew longer and longer. Sometimes he would sit in a dark corridor and wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. But then he would remember his promise. He would remember why he came here, and he would keep working. On the 5th day he met Hyejin. She was a Vraxian overseer assigned to monitor the shipyard. Her job was to make sure no one stole valuable parts from the scrap ships. When she saw Taman climbing out of the Dragon covered in grease and dust, she approached him. "You are still here?" she asked. Her voice came through a translator device that made her sound more curious than mocking. "Yes," Taman replied. He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a dark smear. "The other workers made bets about you. They said you would leave after 3 days. I said 2. It seems we were all wrong," Taman shrugged. "I do not care about their bets." Hyejin tilted her head, studying him. "What exactly do you think you can accomplish here? That ship is dead. The quantum core is destroyed. Even if you had unlimited resources and a team of expert engineers, it would be impossible." "Maybe," Taman said. "But I need to try." "Why?" Taman looked up at the Dragon. Its damaged hull towered above them. "Because no one else will. Because everyone has given up on it." "Sometimes that is reason enough." Hyejin said nothing for a moment. Then she walked away without another word. But Taman noticed that she came back the next day, and the day after that. She would watch him work from a distance, never saying anything, just observing. Taman began gathering parts. He scoured the shipyard for components that might work. Many of the parts he needed did not exist anymore. They had been made decades ago by human factories that no longer operated. So he learned to improvise. He found a broken Vraxian transport ship and salvaged its power couplings. They were the wrong size, so he modified them. He cut them down and rewelded them to fit the Dragon systems. The welds were rough and ugly, but they held. He needed control chips for the navigation system. The originals were destroyed, so he bought cheap processing units from a merchant who visited the shipyard. These units were meant for simple calculators, not starship navigation. But Taman linked dozens of them together in a network. What one chip could not do alone, many chips working together could accomplish. The hull breaches were the hardest problem. The Dragon had holes large enough to drive a vehicle through. Proper hull plating was expensive and hard to find, so Taman cut sheets of metal from dead ships and welded them over the holes. He layered multiple sheets on top of each other, creating thick patches that would hold against the vacuum of space. Other workers started to notice his methods. They would gather to watch him work, shaking their heads at his strange techniques. One afternoon, a group of Vraxian engineers came to inspect what he was doing. "This is madness," one of them declared, pointing at Taman's jury-rigged power systems. "These connections violate every safety protocol. The power flow is unstable. This could explode." Taman looked up from his work. "Will it explode today?" The engineer seemed confused by the question. "What? Will it explode today? Right now?" "Well, no, probably not. But eventually." "Then I will fix it before then," Taman said, and went back to work. The engineers left, muttering to each other in their language. But Hijin, who had been watching from nearby, came closer. For the first time, she spoke directly to him about his work. "Your methods are unusual," she said. "Carefully, yes, they should not work. But they do work." Taman pointed to a section of the ship where lights now flickered weakly. That section had no power 3 weeks ago. Now it has power. Hijin examined the lights. "You restored power to this section?" "Yes, how?" "The main power lines were completely destroyed. I created new ones. I used cable from 6 different ships. None of it matches, but it carries electricity. That is what matters." Hijin said nothing, but her eyes showed something that might have been respect. Or perhaps just confusion. It was hard to tell with Vraxians. Weeks became months. Taman worked every day from sunrise to long after dark. He ate simple meals from packages he bought at the shipyard's small store. He slept on a thin mat in one of the Dragon's crew quarters. He owned nothing except his tools and his determination. Slowly, impossibly, the ship began to change. Sections that had been dark now had dim lighting. Doors that had been jammed now opened and closed. Systems that had been silent for decades now hummed with power. Hijin started bringing him things. She never said where she got them, but suddenly Taman would find useful parts sitting near his workspace. A box of circuit boards, a coil of high-grade wire, a functioning control panel. She never stayed to see his thanks. She would simply leave the items and disappear. The other workers stopped laughing. They still thought he was crazy. They still believed the Dragon could never fly again. But they no longer mocked him. Instead, they watched with quiet curiosity as the impossible slowly became merely improbable. And deep in the heart of the ship, Taman stood before the shattered quantum core. This was the final challenge. This was the problem that had defeated every engineer who came before him. They had all looked at the broken crystal and seen failure, but Taman had an idea. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It violated everything he had ever learned about quantum mechanics. It might just work. The quantum core chamber was cold even in the middle of the day. Taman sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the shattered crystal column. He had been sitting there for 3 hours, thinking. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with calculations and diagrams. The problem was simple to understand, but impossible to solve. Quantum cores were grown, not built. They required special facilities with controlled environments. The process took years and cost more money than Taman would earn in 10 lifetimes. You could not just make a new one in a shipyard. But what if you did not need to grow a whole new core? What if you could repair the old one? Taman stood and approached the broken crystal. He ran his hand along one of the large cracks. The crystal was cold and smooth, dead, but it still had structure. The lattice pattern was still there, just damaged. On Earth, he had once worked in a factory that made computer chips. They grew silicon crystals using a careful process. You started with a small seed crystal and slowly added more material. Layer by layer, the crystal grew. It was not the same as a quantum core, but the basic principle was similar. What if he could grow new crystal material inside the cracks? What if he could fill the gaps and reconnect the broken pieces? The idea was insane. He had no special equipment. He had no clean room or controlled environment. He had only basic tools and whatever materials he could scavenge. But he had come too far to stop now. Taman spent the next week gathering what he needed. He found old laboratory equipment in a crashed science vessel. Most of it was broken, but he repaired what he could. He needed chemicals, but the right ones were impossible to buy, so he made his own, mixing compounds using procedures he half remembered from his school days. Hyojin found him one afternoon surrounded by bubbling beakers and smoking test tubes. She stared at the strange setup with obvious concern. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making crystals," Taemin replied without looking up. "Here." "Now? Are you completely mad?" "Probably." He carefully poured one liquid into another. The mixture turned bright green. "But it is working." Hyojin moved closer, looking at the small crystals growing in one of his containers. "These are quantum crystals?" "No, not yet. These are just regular crystals. I am practicing, learning the process. Once I understand it completely, I will try to grow quantum material. This is impossible. You need specialized equipment. Trained scientists, years of research." Taemin finally looked at her. "Everyone keeps telling me what is impossible. But they never try. They just accept defeat before they start. There are good reasons why we accept some things as impossible. Maybe. But I prefer to find out for myself." He returned his attention to his work. "If I fail, I fail. At least I will know I tried." Hyojin watched him for a while longer, then left without saying anything else. But the next day she returned with a book. It was old and damaged, but the title was clear. Quantum Crystal Growth and Maintenance. She set it down next to his workspace. This was in the old library section. No one has looked at it in decades. Maybe it will help. Before Taemin could thank her, she was gone. But he picked up the book and read it from cover to cover that night. Much of the information was too technical or required equipment he did not have. But there were useful ideas. Small details that might make a difference. He spent 2 more weeks experimenting. He failed many times. Crystals that grew crooked. Mixtures that turned to useless sludge. Equipment that broke at critical moments. But each failure taught him something. Each mistake showed him what not to do next time. Finally, he was ready. He had grown several small quantum crystals successfully. They were not perfect, but they worked. They held energy. They resonated at the right frequencies. Now he needed to try repairing the main core. He started with the smallest cracks. Using a device he had built from scavenged parts, he carefully deposited quantum material into the gaps. It was slow work. He could only add tiny amounts at a time. Too much at once and the new material would not bond properly with the old crystal. Days passed. Then weeks. Taemin worked with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. He filled one crack, waited for it to stabilize, then moved to the next. His hands developed calluses from holding the delicate tools for hours at a time. His eyes grew tired from focusing on such detailed work. Word spread through the shipyard about what he was attempting. More workers came to watch. They gathered at the entrance to the core chamber, whispering to each other. Some thought he was a genius. Others thought he was insane. Most thought he was both. Hyojin came every day now. She brought him food when he forgot to eat. She reminded him to sleep when he worked too long. She did not say much, but her presence was comforting. He no longer felt completely alone in this impossible task. 3 months after he began repairing the core, something changed. Taemin was working on a particularly large crack when he felt it, a vibration, so faint he almost missed it. He stopped moving and held his breath. There it was again. The crystal was resonating, just barely, but it was happening. The new material he had grown was connecting with the old crystal. They were beginning to work together as one structure. His hands shook with excitement, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not yet, he whispered to himself. Still more work to do. He continued repairing the core with even more care than before. Now that he knew it could work, he could not afford to make a mistake. Each new section he completed brought him closer to the moment of truth. Finally, after 4 months of constant work, he filled the last major crack. The core was not perfect. It never would be. There were still small flaws and weak points, but it was whole. It was complete. Now came the real test. Taemin went to the ship's main power junction. He had already restored power to most of the Dragon's systems, but he had deliberately kept the core disconnected. If he had made a mistake, if the repairs were not strong enough, connecting power to the core could destroy everything. Hyojin stood beside him at the junction. A crowd of workers had gathered outside the ship. They knew something important was about to happen. "Are you certain about this?" Hyojin asked quietly. Taemin looked at her. "No, but I have to try." He reached for the main power switch. His hand hesitated for just a moment. Then he pulled the switch down. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The ship was silent. Taman felt his heart sink. Then the dragon hummed. It was a low sound, barely audible, but it grew stronger. The quantum core was accepting power. It was working. Lights flickered on throughout the ship. Not the weak emergency lights Taman had been using. Real lights. Bright and steady. The ventilation systems kicked in with a whoosh of air. Control panels lit up with displays that had been dark for 30 years. Outside, the crowd of workers erupted in shocked voices. Inside, Hyejin stared at the glowing displays with wide eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it," Taman said nothing. He just smiled. The dragon was alive again. News of the dragon's revival spread quickly. Within days, people from across the sector heard about the human mechanic who had done the impossible. Some came to see for themselves. Others refused to believe it was true. Taman did not pay attention to any of it. The core was working, yes, but the dragon was still far from ready to fly. Having power was only the beginning. He needed to repair the engines, fix the navigation systems, restore the weapons, make sure the hull could hold against the vacuum of space. He worked even harder than before. Now that he knew the ship could live again, he pushed himself to finish the job. He slept only 4 hours each night. He ate while working. His clothes were permanently stained with grease and burn marks from welding. Hyejin tried to make him rest. "You will collapse if you continue like this," she warned. "I can rest when the ship is finished," he replied. Not looking up from the control panel, he was rewiring. "You are being foolish." "Yes. Probably." He finally looked at her and smiled tiredly. "But I have been foolish from the start. Why stop now?" The engines were a major challenge. The Dragon had 6 main thrusters and dozens of smaller ones for maneuvering. Most were damaged beyond simple repair. The internal components were melted or cracked or simply missing. Original replacement parts did not exist anymore, so Taman did what he always did. He improvised. He took thruster assemblies from 3 different types of ships and combined them. He modified the mounting brackets to make them fit. He rewrote the control software so the ship's computer could manage the mixed systems. It should not have worked. The engines were never designed to operate together, but Taman made them work anyway. He balanced the thrust outputs. He synchronized the firing sequences. He tested each engine individually, then in groups, then all together. When he finally fired all 6 main thrusters at once, the whole ship shook. The sound was like thunder. Workers outside the Dragon stumbled backward in surprise. Inside, Taman watched the power readings and grinned. The engines were running at 85% of their original capacity. Not perfect, but good enough. One evening, as Taman was welding a hull patch, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see a man he did not recognize. The stranger was human, older, with gray hair and scars on his face. He wore the kind of clothes that people wore in the outer colonies. Practical, worn from hard use. "Are you Taman?" the man asked. "Yes." The man looked around at the ship, his eyes taking in all the repairs. "My name is Dongyun. I came a long way to meet you. Why?" "Because you did something everyone said was impossible." Dongyun stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I fought on this ship 30 years ago. I was just a young soldier then. The Dragon was the pride of the human fleet. When it was captured and destroyed, many of us lost hope." He reached out and touched the wall gently, like greeting an old friend. "We heard rumors that someone was trying to repair it. None of us believed it, but I had to see for myself. It is not fully repaired yet," Taman said. "There is still much work to do, but it lives. I can feel it." Dongyun smiled, and there were tears in his eyes. "You brought it back. You gave it a second chance." Taman did not know what to say. He had not thought much about what the Dragon meant to others. For him, it had been a challenge, a puzzle to solve. But now he understood. This ship was a symbol. It represented something important to people he had never met. "Will you fly it?" Dongyun asked. "I'm a mechanic, not a pilot. But you built it. You know this ship better than anyone." "Maybe, but I can pilot it," Dongyun interrupted. "I flew ships like this during the war, and I can bring others. People who remember what the Dragon meant. People who want to see it fly again." Taman thought about this. He had been so focused on fixing the ship that he had not considered what would happen after. Where would the Dragon go? What would it do? "We will talk about it," he finally said. "But first I need to finish the repairs." Dongyun nodded. I will wait. I have waited 30 years. I can wait a little longer. Over the next weeks, Dongyun proved useful. He understood military systems that Taemin had never worked with before. He helped repair the weapon targeting systems. He tested the shield generators. He knew which systems were critical and which could wait. More people arrived. Old soldiers who had served on human ships. Engineers who wanted to help. Even some young people who had only heard stories about the dragon but wanted to be part of bringing it back to life. Taemin organized them into teams. Some worked on the hull. Others handled internal systems. A few focused on the complex computer networks. The work went faster with more hands, though Taemin had to check everything carefully. He trusted these people, but he knew every detail of this ship. He could not let anything be done incorrectly. Yijin watched the growing group with mixed feelings. She had grown used to it being just her and Taemin working on the ship. Now there were dozens of people coming and going. The quiet shipyard had become busy and loud. One day she found Taemin alone in the core chamber checking the quantum crystal. Are you worried? She asked. About what? About what happens when the ship is finished. You have made something powerful. Others will want to control it. Use it for their own purposes. Taemin was quiet for a moment. Yes, I worry about that. But I cannot let fear stop me from finishing what I started. The dragon deserves to fly again regardless of what happens after. The Vraxian military will not be happy. They thought this ship was safely destroyed. I know. They might try to take it from you. Or destroy it again. Taemin looked at her. Will you tell them? Hyejin met his eyes. No, I will not tell them. Why? She smiled slightly. Because I want to see if this impossible thing can become real. Because I have watched you work for months and I believe you deserve to finish. And because someone who works this hard for something should not have it taken away. Taemin felt a wave of relief. He had not realized how much her support meant to him until that moment. Thank you. 2 weeks later, the dragon was ready. All systems were operational. The hull was sealed. The engines were primed. The weapons were armed. It was not the same ship it had been 30 years ago. It was something new. Something that should not exist. But it was ready to fly and just in time. Because scouts had spotted Vraxian military ships approaching the sector, someone had finally reported what was happening at the shipyard. The dragon had very little time left before it would be taken or destroyed. It was time to leave. The Vraxian fleet appeared on the horizon just after dawn. 6 warships, their weapons charged and ready. They moved in formation, spreading out to surround the shipyard. Their message was clear. Nothing would escape. Inside the dragon, Taemin ran through the pre-flight checks one last time. His hands moved quickly over the controls, confirming that every system was ready. Dongyun sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the navigation console. Behind them, a crew of 12 occupied the other stations. All of them were volunteers. All of them knew the danger. Hyejin stood near the entrance ramp, torn between 2 choices. She could leave now and return to her post. Pretend she knew nothing about what was happening. Or she could stay and become a traitor to her own people. Taemin noticed her hesitation. He walked over to her. You should go. Before the fleet arrives. They do not need to know you helped us. They will figure it out eventually. I have been here every day for months. Then lie. Say we tricked you. Say you were just doing your job as overseer. She looked at him for a long moment. I could do that. It would be the smart choice, she paused. But I did not help you because it was smart. I helped you because it was right. You will be labeled a traitor. Perhaps. Or perhaps I will be the one who saw potential where others saw only failure. History is written by whoever survives to tell the story. She smiled. I want to see if this ship can fly. Taemin nodded and sealed the entrance ramp. Hyejin took a seat at one of the engineering stations. She knew these systems now almost as well as he did. If something went wrong during flight, they would need every skilled person they could get. A warning light flashed on the communication console. One of the crew members, a young woman named Mireille, opened the channel. A Vraxian commander's face appeared on the main screen. Attention vessel Dragon. You are ordered to power down immediately. That ship is the property of the Vraxian Empire. Any attempt to launch will be considered an act of war. Dongyun looked at Taemin. What do we do? Taemin thought for only a second. We fly. They will shoot us down, they will try. But I did not rebuild this ship just to hand it over. He turned to Mirai. Cut the channel. Dongyun, start the launch sequence. The dragon's engines roared to life. The sound echoed across the shipyard, shaking the ground. Outside, Vraxian workers scrambled for cover. They had never heard a ship this powerful start its engines. The warships immediately changed course, moving to intercept. Energy weapons charged with a high-pitched whine. Targeting systems locked onto the dragon. Shields up, Taman ordered. Heejin activated the defensive systems. Energy barriers flickered into existence around the dragon's hull. Dongyun's hands moved across the controls. The dragon lifted off the ground slowly at first, then faster. The landing pad cracked under the force of the engines. Metal debris flew in all directions. The first shots came from the Vraxian fleet. Brilliant beams of energy cut through the air. Most missed as the dragon accelerated upward. One hit the shields, which flared bright blue but held. Shield strength at 90%. Heejin reported calmly. More shots followed. The Vraxian ships were experienced hunters. They knew how to lead their targets. But Dongyun was not flying like a normal pilot. He threw the dragon into maneuvers that should have been impossible for a ship this size. Sharp turns, sudden drops, rolls that made the hull groan. How is this ship so agile? Dongyun shouted over the roar of the engines. It should not move like this. Taman grinned. I made modifications. The engine balance is different now. The mass distribution changed when I replaced so many parts. It moves better than the original design. You created something new. I created something better. The dragon climbed higher, breaking through the atmosphere. The Vraxian ships followed, but they were falling behind. They had not expected the old war cruiser to be so fast. Space opened up before them. Stars glittered in the infinite darkness. The dragon's sensors showed clear routes to jump points where they could escape into faster-than-light travel. But the Vraxian fleet commander was not giving up easily. The warships spread out in a wide net, trying to cut off all escape routes. More ships were coming. The commander had called for reinforcements. We need to get to that jump point, Dongyun said, pointing at the navigation display. But they are blocking our path. Then we go through them, Taman replied. That is suicide. No, that is what they think. Taman moved to the weapons console. Heejin, divert all reserve power to the forward shields. Everyone else hold on to something. The dragon accelerated directly toward the center of the Vraxian formation. The warships opened fire with everything they had. Energy beams and missiles filled the space between the ships. It looked like a wall of death, but Dongyun threaded the dragon through the gaps in the fire. His hands moved faster than thought, adjusting course 100 times per second. The ship twisted and turned, never staying in one vector long enough to be hit. When shots did connect, the shields absorbed them. The forward shields, boosted by Heejin's power rerouting, held strong. The dragon punched through the center of the formation before the Vraxian ships could react. Behind them, the warships scrambled to turn around. But the dragon was already at the jump point. Taman initiated the faster-than-light drive. The quantum core that he had rebuilt from scratch hummed with power. Space itself seemed to bend around the ship. In a flash of light, the dragon disappeared into the void between stars. The Vraxian fleet was left behind, their weapons useless against a target that no longer existed in normal space. Inside the dragon, the crew erupted in cheers. They had done it. They had escaped. The impossible had become real. Taman collapsed into a chair, exhausted but smiling. Heejin sat beside him, looking equally tired and equally happy. Where do we go now? She asked. Taman shrugged. Somewhere free. Somewhere we can decide our own future. Dongyun turned from the pilot's seat. There are human colonies in the outer rim, independent places. They would welcome the dragon. They would welcome all of us. Then that is where we go, Taman said. The dragon sailed through the void between stars. It was no longer the ship it had been 30 years ago. It was something new, something born from one man's stubborn refusal to accept defeat, something that proved a simple truth. Never underestimate a human who refuses to quit. They said a man could not fix it. They said the dragon was beyond repair. They said the quantum core could never be rebuilt. They said it was impossible. They were wrong. Taman had rebuilt the dragon from scratch. And in doing so, he had shown the galaxy something important. Humans might not have the most advanced technology. They might not have the biggest ships or the strongest weapons. But they had something more valuable. They had determination. They had creativity. They had the ability to look at a broken thing and see not what it was, but what it could be. and sometimes that was enough to change everything.